Hello everyone and welcome to the 49th episode of our Navigating Turbulent Times series. Don't know where time's gone as it's the 49th episode, but as you can see on your screens today, today's webinar is about access and inclusion, neurodiversity and the built environment. So I'm Peter Brogan, Head of Research and Insight at IWFM, and many of you would have seen me host our webinars, our previous episodes. But today's episode, as I mentioned, is about neurodiversity, and we do hear these terms bandied around or used, but what does that actually truly mean to the FM and workplace professional in terms of what does that mean for your workplace and how can you get involved? So to make more sense of this and obviously add more than what I've just said there, you can see the picture and also a camera of Jean Hewitt, inclusive design consultant for Burrell Holpold. I've known Jean for probably going on about 7 years on and off as a stellar member of the Institute. And I understood that basically within this area in terms of accessibility and inclusion matters, Jean's been working in this area for over 20 years. So we do have a stellar speaker today to talk you through the episode. I just want to remind individuals at this stage, this is a live webinar and we do have some polls, so no spoiler alert here. We do want you getting involved in the polls today. We do have a dedicated questions section, so if you could send your questions in as the presentation goes along, I'm sorry, we can do that under the dedicated Q&A section. So as advertised, this is only 45 minutes today, so this isn't really for me to waffle on and on, you'd be pleased to know. So I'd like to hand over now to Jean to talk us through today's webinar, and more importantly, how workplace and facility management professionals have a role to play in this area, and also some of the work that Jean's been working on in terms of developing some standards around this area that she's presenting today. So as promised, it's 45 minutes. I'm going to hand over to Jean today. So good afternoon, Jean, and take you through today's webinar, and I'll be back later for Q&A.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. So I'm going to talk about neurodiversity in the built environment and also touch on a couple of other areas around inclusive design and management, which I think might be of interest. A little bit of background on me, really. As Peter just said, I've been a member for some time. 1997, I originally joined, and just in the last few weeks, actually, have recently upgraded to certified member. So if you've been in IWFM for a while, might be something that you'd like to look at as well, because it's a really easy process. So I originally had an FM background, and a chartered FM surveyor as well, and I moved into accessibility in 2001. So I've been in the field for quite a while, specialised in this area, but many of my clients are still FMs, very involved with IWFM. I write the Good Practice Guide, the Managing Accessible Inclusive Places, and so now in its 3rd edition, and I'll touch on that at the end of today's session. I sit on a BSI committee for standards in the UK around accessibility, and I represent IWFM on that committee and have done so for over 10 years now. I also have, apart from my role at Bureau Happold, I have a part-time role at UCL, where I lead a module on designing inclusive places, which is part of an MSc program on health, wellbeing and sustainable buildings. So it's a connection there as well. And that is about designing inclusive places, but also managing them as well, an important component. I've also had some involvement on a COVID standard on accessibility and disability on that, alongside other key players who are IWFM members. So I can touch on that today as well. So just to start, I wanted to quickly look at the principles of inclusive design, inclusive management. It's really about placing people at the heart of the process, acknowledging that we're all a little bit different. We're different physically, we're different mentally, we're different in many, many ways. And acknowledging that and offering dignity and choice and spontaneity to everyone, making sure our buildings are flexible to use, so designed to allow for some flexibility in the way it's used, and that buildings and environments are convenient and enjoyable for everyone. And that means a holistic approach usually to get it really right. So it starts with the journey to the building. The design is obviously a critical component, but thereafter, most of a building's life is really under the management regime. And I know when I started out in inclusive design 20 years ago, I had some really interesting discussions with the Equality Challenge Unit and the disability units. And they said, actually, the DDA, which I know a lot of people in FM refer to this as DDA still, a very old term, the DDA was actually the FM's baby, because at the end of the day, you're the people at the front line trying to deliver good services and inclusive services to everyone. And if the design lets you down, you just have to work much harder at that. The other aspects I've got on there, of course, is technology and information, which is a growing field, and attitudinal. So this is down to people training. So to kick off then, here comes our first poll. What does neurodiversity, the term neurodiversity, mean to you? And there's 4 answers popping up on your screen now. I can't vote, unfortunately, but I do know the answer. But I'd be really interested to know, because I know terminology does evolve and you may have different views on this. So I think, shall I move on, Peter, and then we come back to this a bit later with the answers?
I think, Jean, the answers may appear straight away. So just to let you know, so if we just give the audience a couple more seconds to vote, then I think we will get the answers almost immediately. And there you go. Great.
Right. Well, I've got a really informed audience then. So 74% have correctly said it's the diverse spectrum of neurocognitive profiles in humans. So it's everyone on this call are all under that neurodiverse umbrella. Historically, it was a term that used to be referred to autism specifically, and some people within with those conditions may still feel some degree of ownership of neurodiversity or being neurodiverse, but actually I think in reality what they mean is neurodivergent. So I'll just come on to that in a moment. So my awareness of designing around different sensory needs goes back to 2009. I was already looking at sight and hearing loss, but then I was approached by the Equality Challenge Unit, who deal with the higher education sector, to say, can I do a sensory audit? And of course I queried this and said, well, do you mean sight and hearing by sensory? And they said, oh, and autism. And that was the first time I'd come across a deeper need. We need to look at this in a big way. So it was very interesting. So at that time, I worked with the Autistic Society, as well as RNID and RNIB, to look at what would be the questions I would ask. What am I looking for when I'm looking for all 3 elements? Fast forward then to 2016, when the BSI organised some research by the Helen Hamlin Society around neurodivergence and different sensory qualities that people have. So they interviewed loads of people with autism, ADHD, dementia, and other known conditions, and asked them what they thought of the built environment. And from that came 11 strands of interest that needed to be addressed. Fast forward again then to 2021, and here I am, very fortunately sponsored to be technical author of a new standard, a publicly available specification for the BSI. It's going to be called Design for the Mind, Neurodiversity and the Built Environment. So with the correction already going through on the name, which will be out later this year. So I'm going to talk a bit about that. Another trigger for me was also my work with the BBC. So they had engaged me to do inclusive design on their new Cardiff headquarters back in 2016. And a key element for them was looking at neurodiversity across their employees. And they had a couple of individuals within the organisation who had taken this quite a step forward. So I was really building on that and how we do that. And that's had quite a bit of press coverage as well. It just shows that thinking about neurodiversity is very good for your business as well. And I'll come on to sponsorship of the PAS, but they are one of the sponsors. So what is neurodiversity then? We don't come in a one-size-fits-all neurologically package any more than we do in physical shape and size. And there will be natural and normal genetic variations to that. We're all different. We think and process information slightly differently from one another. We learn differently, we communicate with others differently. And from my experience, we find our way from A to B. So I do quite a lot of wayfinding, and the way that we process that information it can be very different in any given 2 or 3 individuals. So we experience the world in a slightly different way. So neurodiversity is the whole population. Then neurotypical is around, we think, 70–80% of the population. And what does that mean? It means that your cognitive profile is fairly even. So if you look at that little indicative graph there, there's a dotted line running through it, and someone who's neurotypical, completely typical, would be a straight line, which is never heard of. Most of us have got a slight variation, and I don't know if you can see it, but there's a very slight purple line running through that. It's got slight dips. So, you know, I'm better at English than I'm at maths, and maybe a little bit weaker at science and so on, and that's how someone's profile would look. And then we see the really big zigzags, and that is just typical of a neurodivergent person, so not fitting the majority model. So you can see areas that are maybe much weaker than others, but also areas that may be really, really strong. And there's a much bigger difference between the strengths and the weaknesses in a neurodivergent model, if we should say. There's also neurodegenerative, which is a term that's applied to someone not born with neurodivergence, but acquiring it. So it's a progressive condition. Dementia is a typical example of that. So that's the terminology. Under the neurodivergent heading then, you might see conditions like ADHD, anxiety, general anxiety disorder, which sounds quite a mild condition, but actually can be quite life-changing. Autism, which many of you would be familiar with, dementia, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette's, and so on and so forth. But of course, our brains are not in neat, tidy boxes like this. And we really shouldn't be putting people into boxes with labels. Labels can be helpful when you're trying to get some support and education. But outside of that, we just need to accept we're all a bit messy and we're all neurodiverse. And this lovely drawing from Professor Amanda Kirby is quite a leading light around neurodiversity. I'm very grateful to her to be able to use that here to illustrate this. So the challenge today has been that our understanding of people who are not neurotypical, so neurominority conditions, is growing, but it's not growing much around the built environment. So there's some pockets of really good information around dementia care, and there's some other pockets around autism and special educational needs type environments, but very much more limited guidance on how we do this in a mainstream environment, which most of you will be delivering services in. And the reason for this, the complexity of individual needs can really conflict and contrast. And there is quite a well-known saying that I'm sure you've all heard: if you've met one person with autism, you met one person with autism. And therefore it becomes perceivably very, very difficult to try and work your way through this. So what we've done with developing the PAS guidance is to take a first step towards a formal standard for this. And what we've had to do is to focus on the things in the environment that affect people the most in a bad way. To try and even out some of those elements that affect people on a day-to-day basis and can cause a lot of stress and distress and sensory overload, basically. So what a PAS is a publicly available specification. It's produced very quickly, has a technical author, which in this case is me, and I don't need to be a leading expert on neurodiversity. I have a fabulous steering group who are experts and a wider review panel later, and they make sure that I stay on course. So I'm writing the document, but others are very much contributing to that. And the development of any PAS, because it has a very short shelf life and it's really an evaluation type standard, has to be sponsored. And in this case, the main sponsor is Transport for London. They're hugely interested in this. Their environments are very challenging to many people who experience sensory overload. The BBC Workplace, I'm delighted to say, is also a sponsor. following my work with them on Cardiff. I'm delighted that they are involved with this. They're very passionate about getting it right. Forbo flooring, hugely interested, because of course flooring is one of the biggest environments, the biggest surfaces that you see as you move around a building, so it can make a significant difference. And then my role as technical author is sponsored by my employers, Bureau Happold, and we're multidisciplinary. So we have a lot of teams that are interested in this, including our lighting, acoustics and facades teams. So the draft's underway. I've finished the first draft. It's going to the steering group. It's been to the steering group once. I'm just making some amendments before it goes to them again, and then it will go out for public review and should actually be published towards Christmas, I hope, because all these stages take quite a bit of time. And we're hoping to get a lot of feedback that we can act upon. So it is founded on that Helen Hamlin research, although what I've had to draw upon is existing standards elsewhere on lighting and acoustics that would be good to adopt. And we know that some of those better standards are not adopted everywhere, and that's part of the issue. So it signposts quite a lot to other standards and guidance. And it's also been influenced by recent research by individuals or other organisations, academic organisations, including some of my students from UCL. So with a bit of encouragement, this is a good area to research. We've got some really nice pockets of research that's been done allied to neurodiversity, which is really good. So the scope is all built environments for mainstream public use. So what we've said in there is it's not intended for housing, and it's not intended for special education needs, and it's not intended particularly for dementia care settings or care settings. However, I still think there's a lot in there that might be useful to some of those environments. It's just that they would need to take it a step deeper for the specific needs. The purpose is, as I say, to give you an information source that could be evaluated in use. It's voluntary, nobody has to follow it. And the idea is that people then feedback, and the typical shelf life for any PAS with British standards is 2 years maximum usually. And then it disappears. Either it's withdrawn completely, or more usually it would get absorbed into one of the other one or more existing standards. And in this case, we think it will probably go into the BS 8300, which is my day-to-day Bible around accessibility. That's the most obvious location for it to go to. Although it only says design in the title, like all British standards associated with accessibility, is design and management. And the target audiences are architects, planners, building managers like yourselves, and any decision maker, really, an employer. Every building type, from your local museum to your town hall to offices, hospitals, and so on, healthcare, etc. And specialists, the deeper care, as I said, is not covered. So what were the key considerations that we found then? Well, sensory overload from visual and audible noise. If you have a child with a neurodivergent condition, quite often when they see a startling pattern or anything visual, they will hold their hands over their ears. There's that confusion about, I know I've got sensory overload, I'm not quite sure where direction it's coming from. So we talk about visual and audible noise. So that could be bright colours, it could be particular types of patterns, which I'll come on to. Lighting is a really big and important part of this. It can help people relax and focus and to navigate and orientate properly and easily, but it can also startle, and it can cause disability glare and cause migraines and all sorts of other things when it's not right. The layout needs to be simple, logical, clear sight lines, so things that would help everybody, help neurodivergent people even more. Quite often there can be wayfinding difficulties, which might be to do with the smaller working memory, like your live mode, if you think of it in computer terms, for many people. I've discovered during the process of this PAS that the reason why I'm so awful at wayfinding is probably because my working memory is not good at retaining that live information. I'm better with sort of longer term information. And that's really interesting. So I've obviously I'm neurotypical, but with a spike around wayfinding. And other people will be like that. You'll have your own spikes somewhere. So a truly spiky profile where you've got a lot of them. Familiarity we found is important too. So if your building fits an already understood model, so we don't want to do things that are startling and surprising, and doors that don't open in a logical fashion and things like that, becomes much harder. And another key area was opportunity to preview. So if you can provide information about your building, and this is something FMs are quite good at, telling people how to get to the building, telling people what the experience might be like when they get there, particularly our public buildings, is really, really important. And just the opportunity to do that can really ease that anxiety and uncertainty before you enter a space. So whether it's information you've received before you even travel, or information that you can receive by looking through windows when you get there, that can be really, really reassuring and take away a lot of the stress from the situation. What I found was interesting when we were looking at these sensory overload type conditions is that people who aren't neurodivergent, they might be neurotypical, but they might be a migraine sufferer, or like my husband, they might have a vestibular condition. He's got mania, so it affects his balance. And some of the things that we found around neurodivergence and the sensory overload also affect many other people. So I think it's really, really important that we don't say this is only for neurodivergent people. What we've said in the standard is it's around sensory processing and how we process information visually, acoustically, but taste, touch, and so on. And it's really looking at that in more detail, which affects all of us at some point. So just to be clear, the hypersensitivity is where someone has extreme physical sensitivity and they can experience a sensory overload. It's typical lighting, it could be touch, it's often acoustics and background noise. There's also the 70% of people who are diagnosed as neurodivergent will have the hypersensitivity, and the other 30% hypo, which means they actually seek out that bigger sensory stimulation. And for that, we don't feel a standard is quite so important, because people can add their own stimulation. So if you took a typical quiet room, which we might make in very calming colours, if someone has hypersensitivity and they need to use that space, they can use different devices to stimulate them, or they could turn on noise. It's much more difficult the other way around if an environment is already too noisy or too bright, and so on. So that sensory overload, when it happens, what do we mean by that? Well, it can affect heart rate, it can affect breathing, blood pressure, it can make you confused. I was talking to someone on the phone this morning in healthcare settings, and they were saying people zone out because they can't cope with everything that's going on. So it can manifest in a number of ways, but it's very distressing, and it's fully fixable, really. These were the strands that came out from the Helen Hamlin Society. So you can see the acoustics and lightings in there, familiarity, preview, etc. And when we've come to develop the standard, we've decided to include external and internal environments, specifically adding wayfinding, because that came up quite a few times. And I suppose the surprises for me, we've added a few MEP items. So by that, I mean mechanical, electrical power. So off-gassing of carpets, things was an issue. VOCs in the air quality is important. Control of temperature, control of air quality was important as well. We've looked at quiet and restorative spaces, which I'll come on to in a second. We're including how people get out of the building as well as how they get in, because it's really important. And also how you do stakeholder engagement. Because if you're changing your building, talking to the right, all of your stakeholders is important. And we also recognize that actually you might have to go a little bit further to encourage some people with neurodivergent conditions to engage on this. They may not always be people that are comfortable sitting down in a big meeting room with others. There might be people that want to do it by text and other ways. So we're going to include an annex around stakeholder engagement to make sure that's inclusive as well. Just looking at a couple of patterns here. Some of you might feel some of these patterns are a bit objectionable. You wouldn't have them in your own home. Generally speaking, the linear and squares and so on can cause more of an aversive type pattern, one that moves and shifts. And the more natural patterns were better. So if I'll show you this one. This is full of fractal patterns, so they're biomorphic. So if they're trying to replicate what happens in nature, and generally speaking, we're hardwired to find these less intrusive to our thoughts and more acceptable. There's a lot more to this, and I do have, as an ex-student at UCL, is trying to develop an app look at all this in more detail. And there's been some interesting work, not only by him, but also by University of Greenwich, I think it was, around aversive patterns and epilepsy. But we also want to look at it around neurodivergence and how they impact on people's concentration and so on. Mental health has a huge overlap with this. So I'm not saying if you're neurodivergent, you have a mental health condition, illness, because that's not necessarily the case, but it is more likely. And the reason for that is because the environments are putting you under strain every day. There might be other social aspects to it as well. So our neuro profile can be a significant factor to our mental well-being generally overall. And I think the more we can improve our environment, the better this will be. The quiet and restorative spaces that help with recovery from sensory overload are really, really important. So we can't make every environment really calm probably, but we can make little breakout spaces or rooms or places that people can go to just to feel better, reset themselves and then come back in. And I think biophilic design, which everyone is talking about now, can be really, really helpful in providing how we incorporate nature into our environments inside and out, and that connectivity to help people with mental health conditions, but also can be very calming for everyone. So biophilia, in case you're not familiar with that term, it's really about our connectivity with nature. We're all hardwired for this, and how can we bring it inside? Could be natural finishes. It's more than just a pot plant like I've got behind me for example, much more than that. I'm grateful to one of my ex-students, Toar, architectural background. She's an amazing piece of research around quiet spaces. So we've got quite a significant section in the guidance on that, because we know that everybody does their quiet room and their face room. They're quite often one and the same. They have them merged together, and they're not quite working for either party on that. So just to finish on the neurodiversity aspects, I mean, I would say that for several decades now, I and many others like me have really tried hard to capture the diversity of our human physical needs with door widths, reach distances, ramps, seated heights, etc., etc. I think now we're truly beginning to recognise the importance of an environment for our mental well-being and our capacity for thought, emotion and behaviour. Really, really important. We're not separate from our environment ever. It always influences, and in some cases more than others. So if I was to create a beautiful garden, I would plant lots of little flowers. I would want lots of different flowers. And they would want different soil types and different watering regimes, different feeding regimes. Human beings are no different to that. We don't all thrive in the same environment, and we really need to start looking at this and providing choice. So to sum up, really, these were some of the things I've talked about. We see them as part of the big access and inclusion agenda now, that every environment, whether it's in the regulations or not, we should be thinking about our neurocognitive profiles and how our buildings support that. So second poll then, do you have quiet restorative spaces at work? If you do, what do you have? So you don't know, or you're unsure, or nothing is provided at all, or maybe you have a multiple use space that you use and say that's the face room as well, or is it a completely separate space that's been thoughtfully designed? That's fantastic to know that 24% have a special space for this. Are really, really good. Some and more than that have a multiple use. Sadly, 43% with nothing provided, and then a few don't know. Okay, interesting. I do think there's going to be a drive going forward to have spaces and to have separated space. I think it's quite important to do that, and hopefully the standard will help to promote and be a catalyst for that. I'm very quickly now, just to finish, going to touch on a couple of other areas that I've been involved in, which you may not have thought about. One was COVID and disability. There's loads and loads of standards out there, and I know IWFM has done a lot on this as well, and it's sort of really where to start. As far as we were aware when we were called in last year, none of them particularly cover disability and COVID, in a way that people were making decisions about what to do with their buildings, but they weren't considering the variety of disabilities and different needs that people have as part of that. So we're sort of assuming that everybody was the same. So there were, for example, examples of wheelchair users or people with sight loss being refused to come to work, or being assumed that they wouldn't come to work because they were vulnerable. But in COVID terms, they weren't anymore, often more vulnerable than anyone else, whereas a hidden disability, diabetes, respiratory, etc., clearly place someone at a higher risk. So there are lots of things like that going on. And also, of course, which we're all aware of, and there's lots in the news about this, is that some mental health conditions were made worse by the isolation without that proper support. So when we have extended home working or in lockdown, etc., that's something that we all need to work very hard at, as I'm sure you're aware. So I was pulled into a panel by BSI, together with Pip Jackson from UCL, who's the Access and Inclusion Officer, to very quickly get involved in the second edition of what they call a flex standard, which comes out really, really fast, around the disability aspects. And really uniquely, not only is it a free standard, but it transitioned from the August to December to an ISO standard, which is unheard of. And it's a flexible standard. And in the UK, and the ISO is free. They're both free, and you can get them from the BSI website. And we're seeing here about, we've got some stuff in there about psychological health and wellbeing. And so we've tried to spread a bit about disability throughout the document. There's also an annex, Annex B, which you could look at. And I've got a link to this at the end of my slides. Inclusive design is evolving. It's not just evolving in terms of neuroprofiles, it's, and COVID, it's evolving in other ways as well. We're looking at mental health and wellbeing generally. I'm now looking at menopause, nursing mothers' needs. There's been loads around all gender versus segregated toilets as well. And I think it needs a deeper dive into what faith provision we should provide as well. Changing places, some of you will be aware there's new requirements just gone into building regs. So certain types of buildings now will have these as new build to get more of these wonderful facilities that make it possible for many families to leave home, knowing, with the confidence of knowing that there's like an adult changing the supported needs available across our built environment sector, public buildings. Finally, just a reminder that I did upgrade the Good Practice Guide last March, and I think many people have been busy on many other things since then, but there is quite a lot of mention around neurodiversity in there. Obviously, it hasn't got the volume that the PAS has, but there are bits in there to look up, which obviously is free to members, and others can get it from the website. They can buy it on the website as well. I've tried to include a broader approach to inclusion, but I think the way things are moving, we might need another guide next year, perhaps, to add to it again. So that's that. It's a link to me there. There's a link to the BSI PAS guidance there, and the IWFM Good Practice Guide and the COVID guides, which I hope is helpful. Thank you for listening, and I welcome some questions.
Thank you. No, thank you, Jean. And that was really outstanding in terms of the subject areas that you've gone through over the last 35 minutes. And I don't know where time went really, which is always a good sign. So we've got some questions coming through, and thank you already. You need one to kick off. A couple of questions relating to the standard. Can you remind us, Jean, when that standard that you're currently working on is due to be released? The standard that you referred to earlier on in the presentation.
Yeah, so the PAS standard is
the PAS standard,
is either December this year, I think, looking at because they have various stages to go through. It'll either be December, or if we get too close to Christmas, they might decide to bring it out first thing in the new year, so it has the 2022 date on it, because obviously people tend to think it was a 2021 standard back in December is already being old by January. So that there might be a political reason to shift the date, but hopefully I will have been finished on it by October.
No, that's great, because we've had a couple of comments in about that. So we've got a couple of questions. So go to the audience questions, because they are rattling through as they always do on these episodes. So I just want to say thank you to Claire for her question coming in about, does the work include anything on design of housing to support neurodiversity?
Of housing?
Of housing, yeah.
No, it doesn't. We feel that's a more special. I think there's some bits in it that will be beneficial. So when we're talking about acoustics and light and everything, they'd be equally relevant to someone's home. But housing is often treated differently. So there's no reason why they couldn't be adopted in housing, but it's not specifically targeted there.
Okay, thank you, Claire, for the question. We've got a question here from Gabrielle, and it probably linked to a couple points you alluded to, and obviously some of your work at UCL, Jean, around, are there any courses or accreditation on inclusive buildings? So linking to the training skills area on this, and maybe there is still a gap there considering some of the areas you've mentioned that need to be addressed, such as faith rooms and various other bits when it comes to inclusive design. But is there any accreditation training that would be recommended for anyone to have a look at, or is there a raft of it out there?
There are short courses, some of which I deliver myself, which is like 1 day, 2 day events. There's the module at UCL, which is part of the health, wellbeing and sustainable building. So I do a whole module on inclusive places. I think at the moment you probably can't access that as a standalone module, which I think is a shame, and I have been pushing for. When I studied originally, I did a whole master's in it, but all of those master's courses have closed now. So there isn't one. UCL do a disability design innovation MSc, but again, only one module on the built environment. So I think it's short courses. And in terms of accreditation, once someone is experienced at this, they can go for accreditation with the National Register of Access Consultants, which is our accrediting body. But usually someone will have at least 2 or 3 years experience working every day in this field. So we have a shortage at the moment, which is one of the reasons why I love doing the UCL role on that module, because we don't have enough youngsters coming through, and this is a fabulous skill set to add to an FM career. It really is. So I and others do, and I could probably maybe provide some information on that, but typically they're 1 day courses, so they take you on a step, but not hugely.
No, that's great. I'm aware of time and questions are flooding through, Jean, but I'm trying to get through as many for our audience because of the time factors. I had a question in from Robert. What is Jean's view of the stance of the construction sector, built environment, to this topic? Do you find there is a difference in attitude between the public sector and the private sector? So we knew that question may come up, Jean, about the differences between public and private. So with your experience over the 20 plus years, is there one that's leading the other, or is there a gap, or what's your view on that?
It's interesting, isn't it? So I think there's been I think there's, what would you call the BBC? They're sort of quasi public-private, but they've been one of the drivers, and I know they've done a lot to push it forward. And I think there are other organisations. So I've been doing some at BT. They were very keen on making sure neurodiversity was picked up, and lots of these bigger commercials do have their own neurodiversity groups as well as disability groups. So that is starting to happen. I think that's a key driver. I think in the public sector, obviously they have the public sector equality duty, and they're meant to be proactive and a good example. So the places like UCL actually have, again, their own committee, and they're doing a lot on this. So public sector might feel more obligated to do it, but I think the private sector is doing some amazing examples too. I'm sorry, there was a beginning part of that question on construction. I'm not sure I've answered that.
Well, it's your stance on the general view of the construction stroke built environment sector to this topic. So
well, the other thing to say very quickly was that RTPI and town planning, those institutes that deal with the planning right from concept stage, are looking at neurodiversity right now, and there are various streams working forward. So if we can get planners to think about it right from concept stage, I think that makes it happen further down the line. And things like the standards, hopefully there'll be bits of it that will transition to building regs at some point. that would be my dream anyway.
Always good to dream. Right,
Yeah.
Jean, we've got a question in from Gavin about in terms, due to COVID, there's been a lot of focus on ventilation in buildings. Basically, Gavin's question is there any guidance relating to ventilation, basically relating to neurodiversity? So ventilation guidance related to neurodiversity, is there anything that you can think of that may cover that? Sorry, it's quite particular, isn't it? It might be one that...
Yes, no, I'm just thinking in the COVID guidance, we did talk about when you're reopening offices and you've got a really well ventilated space, it can also be much colder, and they need to just alert people with some disabilities because there might be someone that can't maintain their body temperature high enough. So considerations like that. But I don't think it gives specific measures. And in terms of neurodiversity, can be more susceptible to temperature changes, but so can many other groups, like I talked about designing for menopause and designing for other conditions. There are many that actually experience temperature differently, and it's a huge issue. It's always been FM's challenge, isn't it? Trying to get the temperature right for everyone is, yeah, I haven't got a magic wand on that, sorry.
No, that's fine. We've got a question in here about, obviously you linked to the dreaded COVID and it was going to come up, which basically kicked off our Navigating Turbulent Times series. But the point around the remote workers and how there is this term now, hybrid working, of people's office may be there where you're fortunate enough, whether that's actual dedicated workspace or, dare I say it, your dining table or your kitchen table, depends on your preference, or you might not even have a choice. How's that going to be a pressure for future employers to ensure people with such conditions that you've gone through today, and I appreciate there was only so much time you could go through in depth on, how, as a CEO or anyone that runs their own business, what assurances have you got to support people with those conditions if it is a case that there's going to be more of this hybrid working as we move beyond the post-COVID world? Is there any views on that, how an employer can support those conditions?
It's interesting. So if we were talking about neurodivergent conditions, quite often can be helped by the opportunity to have choice. So choice helps everybody really, but the ability to work from home when you want to concentrate has been a game changer for lots of people that find it really difficult in an open plan environment. So even like Bureau Happel, we recognise a lot of people will be in the engineering sector will be neurodivergent, and can be their very strength in engineering might be part of that profile. And you know, if you look across an open plan floor, you'll see them wearing noise cancelling headpiece because it becomes overwhelming, and maybe choosing a corner seat and things like that. So I think we just got to be careful when people go back to work. If they're booking a desk, there are choices about where to book a desk, and you provide the information about quieter zones and vibrant zones where everybody wants to chat. So if you come in to be social, you want one type of space, and if you come in to get your head down because you can't work at home, it needs to be something very different. It's going to be interesting to see how this rolls out. But the hybrid model actually works better for a lot of people, provided they've got that choice.
So, Jean, you kindly mentioned about your work on the BBC Cardiff in 2016. As we move on 5 years, God, where's time gone? Are there any examples of workplaces that have really got this right? So some comments about biophilia and where they've seen it work very well, and others where it hasn't worked so well. Is there any leading workplaces you can think of that actually have got this right? Or is it always evolving? Is it always danger to say that you've got it right?
We always have this problem in inclusive design generally to say that any one building or any one organisation gets it totally right. I think what you can take from it is pockets of examples of this worked really well. So I could give an example from the BBC building, for example, that they wanted some bright colours on the manifestation of the glass, you know, that stops you walking into the glass, on the meeting rooms, which was very attractive when you're outside. And you only pass it momentarily, so it wouldn't cause sensory overload. But when you're sitting in the meeting room all day, it's there in front of you and you can't get away from it. And they applied a milky manifestation on the inside of the glass. So what you saw on the inside was a very, very toned down version of it. And I just think that those sorts of practical examples, so they're little nuggets rather than saying any one organisation's done everything right, or is fully inclusive, which is really difficult to find. There's usually, you know, something that's been overlooked.
Well, Jean, I'm aware of time. We've got a couple more questions that had come through. So what I will do and promise for the audience, I will send that on to Jean afterwards to hopefully come back with an answer or some links to some of your questions. Jean, at this point, I just want to say a massive thank you for going through a fascinating topics. It wasn't just one you covered today in the 45 minutes. And dare I say it, we may see you again on a future episode to maybe talk about the standard in full, because obviously that links to a lot of work that you've mentioned today, and obviously it'd be good to bring the standard to life once it's formalized. So thank you again for today's presentation, and as I say, yeah, we may bring you back, certainly bring you back in terms, if it's okay with you, about the future of that standard and what that actually looks like once it's published. So thank you for today.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Jean. So just a couple more slides for the audience, you'd be pleased to know. Jean mentioned the Good Practice Guide we have, which was kindly written and authored by Jean herself. So that is on the website, along with dedicated content hubs, research reports, good practice guides, which the inclusive access is one I've just mentioned, and guidance notes. So please go to our insight pages where you find all our relevant content. So that'd be good. So just moving on. Yes, Jean mentioned about her work on COVID-19. We do referenced our IWFM resource, I was pleased to see. But joking aside, we do have this COVID-19 resource. It is regularly updated in light of what we've all experienced over the last year plus, and probably continue to do so with policy changes. But as I say, please look out on the website. That is a free access to members, non-members, just to look at the latest guidance and policy coming out of government. So please have a look out for that. Just a plug for our IWFM conference 2021, Emerging Stronger, again, possibly the theme, and I will stick by that, 13th of September. We have announced a number of the speakers for that conference and some of the breakout sessions. It is a hybrid event. Yes, I've used that word hybrid again. It is virtual and physical, so tickets are available both. Love to see you there in person, but obviously aware of circumstances, we do have a virtual ticket as well. So would encourage you to try and join as the program gets further announced. So please look out for more detail about our conference on the 13th of September. So once again, I want to say thank you to Jean today. We've done a 45-minute episode today just to go through a real important piece of work, a work that's evolving with standards, as Jean's elaborated on, and work where there's still areas of skills and training needed, which came out in some of the questions as well today as well, which I hasten to add is something as an institute we should be looking at as well. But I just want to say again, thank you for joining us, Jean, today. A stellar episode, in my humble opinion. We do have a survey, so it's not just to judge today's episode. It's a survey that we'd like you to just to fill in. It's very short, just to enable us to not rate today's episode, as I said. Yeah, you can rate today's episode, but more importantly, about future episodes you would like to see, the content you would like to hear from, the topics you want to hear. So we've done this on every episode. We have listened and acted on this. So that's how we've built our 49 episodes to date, is actually from what our members, non-members, or people that have basically joined these webinars have asked us to do. So please continue that. We look forward to your views on that. Next week's episode, we meet the magical 50 mark. It'd be our 50th episode. That will be announced on Friday. So I can tell you it's in link with our RECO partnership. So continuing our workplace theme, and it's going to link to our guidance notes that we've produced as part of that partnership. So we have a series of 8 guidance notes that talk about the role of workplace technology, culture, visualizing your workplace. So please join us next week for that to find out more. I'm sure it'd be another great episode, but as I say, that will be announced on Friday. But lastly, thank you for the listener viewer that's joined us today on today's live webinar. The recording will be on the website shortly, so it will be up this week for you to look back on or cascade to colleagues that couldn't make today's episode. So thank you once again for joining us. Hope to see you soon, and most importantly, take care. So thank you.